On the operating table today is a NeXT non-ADB keyboard. It's pretty filthy, I know. It works for the most part because I've used it in some previous videos, but some of the keys don't work at all. I know that that upper section here of the numeric keypad doesn't register. Some of those keys here, like the left shift key, specifically the I and the P, are somewhat sticky. You have to press them very hard repeatedly with a lot of force to get them to register. So we'll take this apart, clean it, and see what some of those contact issues might be. Now, simply based off the sound of these, I'm assuming maybe that this is a spring-based mechanism where a spring is located on the inside of the key and it makes contact with a layer underneath where it closes the contact through the metal of the spring to generate the signal for the key press. But we'll figure this out once we take it apart. Then the first thing to come off is these legs here, and this is an interesting concept for a keyboard riser. They are simply rubber feet with the typical NeXT design, and they simply go into these holes here to raise up the keyboard. So we'll take them off and put them aside for cleaning later on. Now let's have a quick look at one of the keys, and I'll have my key puller here. Let's take a specific look at that I key, which is sticky, so we'll carefully try to pull this off, hopefully not damaging anything. And it is not spring-based, at least not in a visible manner. So let's take this apart further and see what this looks like. Alright, it looks as if we might have some broken standoffs, potentially, which explains why some of the screws didn't come out, or didn't want to come out. They're all still stuck in here, but at least one standoff, this one here, looks to be broken. Actually, the rest seem to be in good shape, but this one here is broken off. So that would correspond to this one down here. So I'll have to remove this manually and glue that back on. Otherwise, everything came back out okay. One of the curiosities of these types of keyboards, as well as the corresponding mouse, is that they have this rubber membrane in between the top and the bottom part, and it is filthy. So we'll be definitely cleaning this off, probably treat it with some rubber revival compound, but let's get on with the disassembling this piece. It's also interesting to see how they've put that NeXT logo of theirs on every single piece of hardware, and this is one of the replacement badges, which has these two little plastic legs at the back to put them in pieces like the front of a sound box, but also the keyboard here. So the orientation does correspond to these two little dots on here. It looks like they've simply been clipped off and then glued in place. It looks as if this single standoff here might be plastic welded onto the metal support structure. So off that comes for now. This should be held in place by the screws properly later on, and off it comes. Excellent. Okay. As is often the case with some of those bigger keys, there is most likely some spring or bracket-based mechanism underneath on top of how those regular keys are fixed to the actual mechanism. So it's probably best not to just simply try and rip them off, because you might damage either the keycap or the underlying mechanism, but instead try to carefully pry them out of the socket and then release them from that extra bracket underneath. Okay, all the keycaps are off and ready to go for a little bath and a scrub. There is a bunch of dust and dirt under here, and I can see some signs of spillage around the area where some of the keys are misbehaving. So we'll see if some deoxit or contact cleaner can fix that, or if we need to get new key switches. But let's give this area a good clean before we proceed with that. So I finished a rough cleaning of the surface of the plate and went through a lot of those switches with contact cleaner. But some of those keys, like number pad keys up here, are still not working or just working intermittently. So we'll take a closer look at how to potentially fix that. I've been using two types of contact cleaners. One is kind of classic deoxit. It does its job, however, I'm not a big fan of it in some applications because it does leave a little bit of a greasy residue around. So if I just want to clean something, I typically use this CRC brand, which doesn't leave a residue around, cleans contacts just as well, and is also a lot cheaper. I think I get these cans for about $10 at my local Home Depot. Now, when you use contact cleaner, I do recommend to take the keyboard plate out of the plastic bottom tray, because depending on what contact cleaner you use, it may actually mess with the plastic. This particular one here doesn't do it. It claims to be plastic safe, and I have actually not seen it damage any plastics, but just to be on the safe side, I remove it from the plastic tray and just work on the keyboard itself. So let's try this again. Pry open the top. Leave this in. And the bottom. And then pull out the switch. Now there are some delicate components inside that you definitely don't want to upset. This one is tricky. Now with some careful prying at the back, and then I'll just use a fingernail at the front bracket and trying to hold this in place with one hand. Sorry, hard to see. And then I'll pull this up by the stem in the middle very carefully. Oops. And this is then where it usually falls apart. So in this model here, there is that central stem which comes out. That should be clean and potentially lubricated, and has this contact plate which usually goes in here, and you have a spring that sits in the center of the switch, or will be once. And then we move this around a little bit. There is another metal contact plate inside. And so what I learned from another YouTube video, which I'll also link in the description below, is once this is open, clean this out with contact cleaner. You may want to use either an anti-static soft brush or a Q-tip, but careful with those. They sometimes leave fuzzy residue in here. You might want to use the plastic ones which don't have the actual cotton on it. And sometimes what also helps is bending out this contact plate a little bit. And I've already done this procedure to my shift key here, which was not responding at all, and it works perfectly fine now. Once you do this a few times, it becomes easier. I think my biggest, most important word of advice would be do this in an environment where it's easy to find and pick up tiny little pieces that might just come flying out of this as you open them up, or trying to clean them or put them back together. Like in this one here, as I tried to clean out the inside and then bend the contact plate a little bit, that plate just flew off and I had to find it. So you get the hang of it after a few. Now that we've cleaned those three switches a little bit more, let's try and hook this up and test those keys for functionality. I'm just going to plug this into my NeXT station and boot it up. I am getting some signal if I'm pressing very hard on the key, and I've taken it apart again, but so I seem to get contact, but only intermittently. So I might have to do a deeper cleaning or replace that switch. So I got most of the keys to work reliably except for these three here that I marked with a white marker. So what I'll do now is I'm going to use my desoldering gun to take out the switches and replace them with new-ish ones and see if that remedies the problem. But then hopefully we can finally put this all back together and start using our shiny new NeXT non-ADB keyboard. So let's try and get those switches off without damaging anything. They're now all out, so we clean them up with a little bit of IPA. One thing to note is those vias are a little bit sensitive. I almost lifted 2 of them when I tried to push out the actual switch without completely having removed the solder. So I used the desoldering wick to get rid of everything, and you can see that maybe a little bit here that there's part of that trace that was removed. There's still enough left to make contact, but definitely don't use too high of a temperature. Work fast and make sure that there is no solder left, no connection with the via before you push out or remove the switch. Alright, so moment of truth. Let's try a few random keys. And they all still seem to work. There might be D key is another one that I might have to rectify, but let's try those now. So the Y key. Okay, seems to work reliably. Now let's try that with the P. Yeah, it's still sticky somehow, so not sure what else there might be, but it works more reliably than it used to. And now the 7. Excellent, perfect. All right, I think keyboard mostly 99.9% restored, so we'll put the rest of the keycaps on, the rubber seal, the top, give it one more clean, and then we should be good to go. The case still looks a little bit scratched up, so what I tried was using a little bit of this plastic restorer for cars on it, and I've used this on darker surfaces on one of my cars pretty successfully, but on here for some reason it leaves a very sticky residue, and so I had to actually remove it again. So I don't know if there's any other product, anything better that anyone has tried out on black or dark plastics. I know I've used this on a Macintosh TV before and that worked, so maybe it's something to do with the surface that didn't work, but oh well, for now we'll just have to leave all of that scratching and unevenness as is, and we'll continue to reassemble the keyboard. I've had some difficulties getting that properly seated back in here, and the reason is there is a little magnetic shield around this ribbon cable here, and that moves around on that cable. It doesn't show right now, but maybe this makes it clear. There's a little recessed section here that supposedly needs to go into for that whole PCB to fit, and if that moves around freely on the cable, it might actually end up somewhere where it doesn't take up that space, and then the rest of the keyboard doesn't fit in here. And for those of us who can never remember where the individual keys go, no matter how many times you've assembled a keyboard, we'll just use a second one as a template and hope they match up region-wise. So let's do this. And finally, all done. after how many days of trying to restore this, I'm so glad this is all back together. Now for the final touch, we'll put those little rubber feet back on the back. Spare keyboard can go. And those simply plug into these outer screw holes, and they're meant to be kind of elevating that keyboard so it's a little bit more ergonomic to type on. But yeah, that concludes the restoration of this keyboard. It looks shiny and almost new, but that will go quickly once I remove the remainder of that plastic restorer. But at least now I have a keyboard where I don't have to press super hard or several times on some of the keys after having exchanged the switches. So I'm all happy about that. I hope you found some useful tips and tricks for cleaning and restoring your own NeXT keyboards, learned from my many mistakes. And thank you for watching.